Good morning. Thanks for getting up so early to join us, but also thank you to the event organizers and event partners for inviting me. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to be among you today. I thought it would be useful, perhaps, especially listening to the conversations here yesterday and also some of the presentations. And I should point out that on this stage here yesterday, there were three fascinating presentations and two that really kind of resonated with me. One from a professorial philosopher and the other from a professorial sociologist, which offered us really rich insights into what we're dealing with in the world we're living in today. But I thought it could be useful if I tried to explain what I think strategic communications is, and why I think it's not the same as counter-disinformation or counter-femi. And I say that because yesterday I was listening to conversations and they were being used almost as if they were saying the same thing. They relate to each other, they connect, but they're not the same thing. I'll spend some time just talking to you a bit about strategic communications, which is a new field of academic research. And I think by that name, it's a new field of political practice. Where should we start? We'll start with the first mention of it in the political and geopolitical space, which, as far as I can trace, is to 1997, Kofi Annan, United Nations. Kofi Annan takes over from Boutros Ghali and asks the question immediately on assuming office, why does nobody love the United Nations when it has such wonderful ideals and values? And it's partly to do, he and his report researchers conclude it's partly to do with the failures of the United Nations in the early 1990s, particularly in Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. But they go on to conclude that it's much more than that. They declare that the United Nations is not fit for purpose, certainly as a communicating organization. One, it doesn't have the internal communications ability for those who work lower down in the hierarchy of the organization to know what the leadership is trying to achieve. And two, and perhaps even more significantly, it doesn't speak to populations around the world with any kind of mutual respect. It concludes that the United Nations needs to learn to listen to people, not preach from a very high moral mountain, and should speak to people in the way that they want to be spoken to, and to listen to them in a conversation. It's not a one-way traffic, it's a conversation. It's a multilateral conversation. And then, of course, we go through the fallout from 9/11, and this very kind of polarized, you're either with us or against us view of Bush 43. And when we get to around 2008, which is a date that will resonate with you all, the Russian invasion of Georgia, NATO starts to run with the term strategic communications, but I think it's fair to say that for some time, NATO uses the term but doesn't actually know what it means. It sounds good, because if you put the word strategy or strategic into anything, it makes you sound clever. Particularly if, as so many governments around the world have done, if you walk down the corridors of power, you'll notice on the door, it no longer says head of communications, it says head of strategic communications, because you get a pay rise with the words strategy or strategic. But still, nobody really knows what it means. And so I think it's important that we try to kind of draw some lines here. Strategic communications is about the shaping and shifting of significant discourses in society. That's the kind of, I think, overarching idea that's going on in strategic communications. It doesn't mean communicating strategically, which is what most people think it means, which is not to say that it doesn't include that. Let me explain. If any of you have children or are close to children in any way, then you'll notice that a newborn baby very, very quickly learns to communicate both tactically and very soon also strategically. So every human being communicates strategically, but not every human being is a strategic communicator. And that's because, how should I put this? To be a strategic communicator is to have access to a kind of private members club. And there are rules that allow you in, and there are rules that exclude you. So the rules that allow you in, let's think what they are. Strategic in this case means long-term, not short-term. Strategic means that which follows the plan. A plan is not a strategy, as we know. A plan is what we all agree in this room, write it down on a piece of paper, we walk out of the front door, and immediately the plan goes wrong, because the world is all about fog and friction. It goes wrong immediately, and that's where strategy kicks in. Strategy is the negotiating and the navigating of a contested environment that gets you eventually to reach your strategic objective. So strategic communications is about the long term. It's about negotiating and navigating your way through a contested environment, an environment where you don't have the right to be heard or seen. You may think you do, and politicians always think everybody is hanging on their every word. The reality is that most politicians are never even heard or noticed, or even if they are, nobody particularly believes what they say, and certainly isn't going to change the way they think or the way they behave. So we kind of need to straighten people out a bit on that count. So you're in a contested environment which is very crowded, very noisy. You're up against a lot of competition. In order to arrive at some kind of strategic objective, and that objective requires a strategic outcome. And that outcome is a positive change. Now, I'm going to put positive change in inverted commas because every one of us in this room has a different idea of what positive change means. But the overall idea is that we are moving towards a better life, a kind of Aristotelian understanding that there is a qualitatively better something out there to which politics should aspire, by which it defines itself. How do we do that? We identify particular audiences. It's not a scattergun approach, it's a specific approach where we try to understand particular audiences and try to engage with them, bring them into a conversation of persuasion. We attempt to influence the way they think. We hope we can persuade them to think differently, or at least to think the way we do, because we feel we have something to offer that offers them something better than what they have. And then hopefully from that thinking process, new actions will emerge, a behavioral change will emerge. If you work in political communications, and maybe even if you work in kind of aspects of marketing, you'll say, well, I get all that. That's what I do. Maybe, maybe not. We're working here very much in the political and geopolitical space. And I think there's a difference. between political communications, stroke geopolitical communications, and strategic communications. If not, why bother having a term called strategic communications? I mean, why have we invented it? And it may have come into being in a kind of haphazard way in the last 25, 30 years. But the fact is, it's with us, and it seems to be a form of political communications that particularly Western governments want to adopt. Having said that, there are other governments who have been tracking, and I'm thinking of China particularly. China has been tracking the academic and the policy discourse around strategic communications. What is it? What is this magic bullet that has suddenly appeared in the early 21st century? And if you read Chinese academic texts, you'll see that they've been following very closely the emergence of and the terminological and the lexical discussions around strategic communications. To the extent that 2 years ago, President Xi of China announced that he was now going to do strategic communications in foreign policy. At home, he was going to continue with propaganda. So here, clearly, there's a misunderstanding going on, or a deliberate misunderstanding going on, because I think the Chinese know exactly, when you read, although it's not been translated out of Chinese, when you read the academic text going back to 2007, I think they have a very clear idea of what we're talking about. And this is the defining factor. And when we talk about a normative view of strategic communications, let me put that in a kind of academic context, very briefly. I think there are maybe, I would suggest, sort of 4 academic lenses that you could use through which to try to understand strategic communications. It could be instrumentalist, and that's something you'll find media agencies, and I mention them because they use government budgets, they work for governments in order to carry out their communications ambitions. Instrumentalist means strategic communications is really how you do it. And it boils down to techniques, tricks, tools, methodologies. There's another way of looking at it, which is functionalist. Given that NATO, now 30 member states, but has invested time, energy, and money into trying to understand what strategic communications is, NATO, I would say, I would apply a functionalist lens to NATO. So NATO always did communications. They had 3 pillars. In the middle, information operations. On this end, PSYOPs, the dark side of communications, particularly in war. And on this side, public affairs, press office. Public affairs does not like PSYOPs, because public affairs says PSYOPs is too close to telling lies, it's getting into that very dangerous territory, and we deal in public affairs, we deal with journalists, and we have to deal with evidence-based truth-telling. Otherwise, we lose all our credibility. So the functionalist lens would suggest that in the case of NATO, for example, strategic communications is all around a kind of embracing, an umbrella term that holds all these different aspects together. Does it? I'm not sure. Then there's an essentialist way of looking at it, which is to ask not what it does, or indeed where it fits into an institution or organization, but to ask, what is it? What is the essence of it? Where's the beating heart of strategic communications? Where's its center of gravity? What is it that makes it different from any other form of political communication, be it propaganda, political marketing, if indeed political marketing actually really exists, but generically political communications or geopolitical communications? What's the essence of it? And then there's, I think, a fourth lens, which I would suggest is a normative way of looking at it. And this is to, I suppose, in an academic sense, is to stray from the objective towards a more subjective view of it. And the normative lens says, what would you like it to be? What do you want it to be? Not just objectively what do you think you're looking at and can you describe it? What do you want to do when you have it in your hands? How do you want it to work for you? And I think this is where we get into differentiating it from other forms of political communication. And I have to put it in a NATO context, not because I'm singing the praises of NATO, it's just quite simply because that's now 30 member states. It's the biggest concentration of people talking about strategic communications in the world. A lot of time is spent on it, a lot of effort, and everyone has adopted it. But it's fair to say that from 2008, it took us till 2017 to get everyone to sign off on a definition. And more to the point, if you think of the political-military alliance, essentially there are two sides. There's the military and there's the civilians. I work for the civilian side, not the military side. And militaries, as you know, write military doctrine. And they update doctrine every 3-4 years, because that's what you do in militaries. It's the rule book. It tells you how to behave, what to do. But we were charged with the responsibility in 2017 on the civilian side of starting all over again with a blank sheet of paper and taking keywords, democracy, liberty, strategic communications, public diplomacy, and redefining them without reference to the military side of NATO. And we found that initially we had two pieces of paper that were running in parallel but didn't always merge until the winter of last year. And the two parallel streams of thinkers came together on the key point that differentiates strategic communications from any other form of political communications, and that is that it has to be rooted in the fundamental values of liberal democracy, which has immediate consequences. It means that Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and then we get into this kind of difficult zone of illiberal democracies, they're not invited into the private members club. Because quite simply, strategic communications is, by this analysis, is a Western, liberal, democratic construct that has emerged in the early 21st century. It is not a generic form of talking about communications. It is very particular and is rooted in a set of values. And there's a kind of genealogy to that. So, we went back to the founding principles of NATO. In 1949, the Washington Treaty. And we looked at the foundation stones of that treaty, and particularly at the concept that NATO was there to safeguard and guarantee the freedoms not just of member nation states, but of individuals and citizens within those states. And that didn't appear in isolation in 1949. It rode off the back of the UN Charter, which talked about individual freedoms, which again echoed Franklin Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Nation speech, where he talked about the 4 freedoms. And you can trace those freedoms back further through the League of Nations. You can even trace them right to the French Revolution. But essentially, what we're talking about is freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship. You choose your own God, and you should be left in peace to worship your own God. And then the freedoms from freedom from oppression and freedom from hunger and need. So strategic communications, certainly in these 2 reports that came out of NATO, and you can download these from the website. One is the military doctrine, and the other is the civilian terminology report. And they came together to say, unless you are committed to furthering the freedoms of the individual, then you're not doing strategic communications. It's as simple as that. It is founded in a value system of freedoms. And clearly Russia does not adhere to that, nor does China, and so on. But it gets more complicated because very actively, those of you who are sinologists and students of Chinese politics will know that China has devoted quite a lot of effort to redefining language. So we're in a kind of language struggle here. So if you go to Chinese texts, you will find them using words like freedom, liberty, democracy. China believes that it is democratic. It tells us that every individual has the right to a vote to elect its government. Of course, those individuals are only in the Chinese Communist Party, which is a very small minority of the Chinese population. And you are admitted into the Chinese Communist Party very infrequently, and so much depends on what your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents have done on the record, or not done. So when they define liberty, when they define freedom, when they define democracy, and then roll those terms back, not just through Chinese diasporas around the world, over which they have enormous sway, enormous influence, but also through what I would call discourse theaters. Discourse theaters like the United Nations, discourse theaters like the concept of the global south, which you mentioned yesterday, BRICS, and ever-expanding BRICS. These are discursive theaters, and language is being used in a particular way to further set of policies, changes that challenge the international order of sovereign states, the rules-based order that we have come to know since the 1940s, and which the BRICS countries, for different reasons of their own, and a new expanded BRICS and the Global South, would argue is a Western American construct that works to the disadvantage of many parts of the world. Right or wrong, that's for you to decide. The question is, as much as what is strategic communications, I think it's always worth asking, well, why is it? I mean, and not just why, but why now? Why now in the early 21st century, is there a feeling, has there been a feeling that we needed another form, a new form of political and geopolitical communications? Where does that come from? Why? And it's very difficult because if you ask people, they just kind of shake their heads and say, I don't know, it's just kind of there, it just emerged. And people started talking about it and using it and wanting to be associated with it. And I think it's really to do with a number of factors. I think there are large kind of geopolitical factors. The change in, because even though, and I should emphasize this, I don't believe that strategic communications should be exclusively attached to war making. It's been, to a certain extent, focused around war recently, because that's in a sense been the kind of progenitor of the concept. But I think when we talk about strategic communications, we're also talking about these big issues that we have to resolve in the world, such as mass migration, unprecedented levels of mass migration, not just internally displaced or war refugees. I'm talking about economic aspirants as well. The largest number of people on the move for who knows how long. Many decades, if not centuries, we don't know. But what about pandemics? What about climate change? These are all bread and butter of strategic communications. It is not just about do we wage war or do we somehow achieve peace. So why? Why now? I think it's to do with, I'll give you an analogy. You know the analogy of the glass being half full or the glass being half empty. A couple of times yesterday I heard people talking about a crisis in democracy. I don't think there's a crisis in democracy. What I think is there's a flutter of self-confidence. There's a loss of self-confidence in democracy, which is not a crisis, unless you see it that way. You could look at it and say the glass is half empty. Democracy is in retreat. Authoritarianism is on the rise. You could say the glass is half full. And democracy, which is very young, modern democracy, is very young, barely 100 years old, if that. And that it is going through a process, a very healthy process, under pressure, yes, but a very healthy process of self-critique, refreshment, re-energizing itself, looking for better ways of delivering on its promises to individuals who form part of democratic populations. So you could look at it in a negative way, you can say it in a positive way. Yes, there's a loss of self-confidence, but loss of self-confidence can be addressed, can be mitigated, and can be restored, particularly if what we're doing is coming up with fresh ideas, how to enrich a particular governance model with a set of ethical values. Why now? I think there is partly to do with war making, a change in the nature of war making since 1945, which went from interstate war to intrastate war, civil wars, or substate war, particularly insurgencies and Islamic fundamentalist insurgencies, through to, more recently, the return of continental wars, state on state. But that's only one factor. Yes, a retreat in terms of the number of countries that might call themselves democratic, but we wouldn't call them that. So if you do the head count, okay, waning numbers since 1990. The digital revolution, yes. speeding up information flows, but also undermining what were formerly more static authority, command and control structures in societies. So this interplay between hierarchies and networks has changed, particularly as a result of digital technologies. But I'm not a technological determinist. I don't like to see everything through the lens of it's all about the internet. It's all about smartphones. An awful lot of it is about those, but it's not all about those. I think it's also about the return of great power politics, and it's about the return of, or at least the arrival of, China's projection of its regional and perhaps global ambitions, and Russia's revanchist, neo-imperialist ambitions in Europe. And also the emergence of a kind of opportunistic de facto axis of those who would challenge what they perceive as an American-dominated world order. They happen to come together at a particular moment in the early 21st century. There's a convergence of mutually reinforcing factors. Does that make this period unique in human history? Well, you could argue every period's unique in human history, and anyway, what is a period? Every generation, and fortunately, unfortunately, I'm old enough to have passed through several generations, or at least several decades, and seen the changes where we felt that every decade was unique. And perhaps it was. But we also felt that the world had never been as complicated and as menacing as it was then, as it is today. Having said all that, I do feel there is something happening at the moment, and it's to do not just with the emergence of different factors at the same time, it's the mutually reinforcing nature of those factors. And I think it's in that context that strategic communications has been wished into existence by, particularly by nation states. But I think that thinking also trickles down to civil society as well, and to the leaderships, the managers of NGOs. It's worth trying to put this into a broader context. How do strategic communications or how do strategic communicators, many of them, view the world? I suppose the three multis: multipolarity, yeah, multi-alignment, yeah, nation states shop till they drop. They go around shopping for the best deal. Maybe you'll get the best security deal out of the United States. Maybe you'll get the best deal out of the United States. Maybe you'll get the best energy deal out of Russia, and maybe you'll get the best trade deals out of China. So a kind of, in that sense, a multi-alignment, and then a multidimensionality, that influence is being played out and calibrated in 5 dimensions: land, sea, air, cyber, space. And that's what makes it more complex. And that's what we're dealing with. So, how does all that relate to disinformation and counter-disinformation? If strategic communications is about the long term, it's about being preemptive, it's about being visionary. Counter-disinformation, counter-FIMI, are about the short term, the tactical, the campaign. And the difficulty that arises from that is if one is about the long term and the other is about the short term, and if the world is becoming ever more transactional, it would appear so, then it's becoming ever more short-termist rather than long-termist. And the problem with the short-termist campaign and tactical thinking, which characterizes counter-disinformation, is you have to ask yourself, what is the measure of success? How do you define success in the counter-disinformation space? Putin says, okay, you win. I'm not going to do it anymore. China says the same thing. Oh, no, we're not going to do disinformation anymore. We've had enough. You win. Is that what it is? What is the end game? What is the exit route for all of you to get on with your lives and do something else, maybe? And this is the problem, that short-termism without any end goal undermines long-termism, which aspires, it may be naive, it may be a bit hippie, but it aspires to long-term visionary change. The two have to work in tandem. The problem is that as long as we conflate the two and think they are the same thing, we're all going to operate in a very kind of muddled professional landscape. The two have to work seamlessly side by side. But in order to do that, those who hold the purse strings over counter-disinformation have to be willing to commit to funding, not just funding, but also the thinking that goes with it, the fundamental assumptions of what you're trying to achieve and when you will have achieved it, that run longer than a one-year contract or a two-year contract of funding. If you really believe in counter-disinformation, and if you believe in it in the context of strategic communications, and I'm being really naive now, if you're a government, you have to commit for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, because that's the duration that other people who would oppose you, who would seek to subvert your political status quo, those are the timescales they're working to. And you can't defeat that kind of thinking with one-year contracts. So strategic communications and counter-disinformation, counter-FEMI, they have to work in tandem. But that means they have to come from the same conceptual base of assumptions and then be structured and funded and require a commitment that unifies them into a single holistic way of thinking. I'll stop on that.
Thank you, Neville, for this very rich and, in the same time, engaged overview of the whole this problematics. Maybe I would like to add that, of course, our value concepts are, in principle, contestable concepts, and we know this from the theory and also from practice. Let's think for the human rights, for example, from the very beginning, after the implementation of the Universal Declaration for the Human Rights starts for many decades, permanent quarrel for struggle for their redefinition between the Soviets and the West insisting mainly on the individual political and civic rights, and the Soviets insisting on the social rights as more important as a normative foundation of the rights, and so on. And this struggle continues up to now because China is producing similar arguments in the United States. But I absolutely agree that the main effort in our answer to this turbulence in the world, turbulence once in a situation when we have everyday uncertainty about what is the truth, and this uncertainty is attacked by different actors, including foreign actors. We should try to consolidate our value notions at first step to to try to convince the others from our political community what these values are and what is their central meaning we are engaged with, and of course to defend them from competitors, contestators from outside. But when we have this general agreement that it's time to prepare a real consolidated, holistic effort to counter disinformations of all kind, who are the actors who should initiate and how they combine their efforts to achieve this goal? Where to start from? And who is to start first? The state, the citizens, the private sector, how to combine this? But maybe before, this is a too general question, that you have the opportunity to answer it, answering the questions from the public. Let's first collect some questions from the public. Milena Jakimova, Velizar Shelomanov. Okay.
I don't think this works. It does now. Yeah. Yesterday evening, we had a lecture, another keynote by Andy Carvin. And he demonstrated the trajectory of what he called co-opting. Co-opting a term, but a term that stands for value approach, for example. Co-opting, say, of fake news, of fact-checking. Fake fact-checking websites used for manipulating audiences. So, as a supporter and admirer of what you are proposing, the value approach, and the revalorization of individual freedom, how do you assess the risks of co-opting Stratcom concept?
Yeah. No, and you're absolutely right to highlight that. It's a very difficult question because it sits within a wider framework of truth-telling and untruth-telling. And I think this is one of the dilemmas that face all strategic communicators. And it's not just the operationalizing, because this is just another form of untruth-telling. It is the very question of what is truth, and what is the relationship between, if you like, two aspects of a conversation around truth. I'm going to, please forgive me, but I'm going to characterize this in a very crude way. There's a kind of philosophical approach to what is truth, and there's the governmental approach to what is truth. And I don't think governments are really talking necessarily about truth. I think they're talking about facts. And when I speak with friends, heads of government communications, they say to me, stop talking about the truth. The government is not about truth. The government is not about trust. So at first, my first impression is, wow, really? I thought it was. And the response is usually, no. You've got to be very clear. Governments don't need to be trusted. They need credibility. And credibility is based on delivering on your promises. They don't set out to be loved. They set out to do what they've been elected to do. Truth is a very philosophical concept. It's an enormous concept. And of course, when it starts to filter into public discourse and becomes normalized in discourse, then it can lead to moral equivalence. Multiple truths which lead to moral equivalence, which lead to fragmentation. So what you're talking about, and quite rightly highlighting the dangers of co-opting, sit within this whole discussion around truth. And when I just speak with for example, the British government, and I say, how do you deal with this? And they say, look, stop being so philosophical, stop being so academic, they say to me, and just think like a government. And that means government deals in evidence-based truth-telling. That's what a government has to do. If you say something, provide the evidence. Now, not everything has evidence, and that's the problem. So we've just seen in the American election, I think it was the third, in the opinion polls, was the third of the driving themes, which was abortion. Where is between the secular interpretation, understanding of that theme, and the religious, fundamentalist, whatever you want to call it, understanding, where is the truth? Many Americans believe that the truth is with God, who ordains what a woman should be allowed to do with her body or not. Others, in a more secular domain, argue, no, it's a woman's right, individual right, to determine what she does with her body. Where is the truth between those two? And that's the difficulty that we have in response to governments who say, we deal in evidence-based truth-telling. It's still, I think, probably the best way. It gives them something to hang on to, because you can't always have a philosophical debate with the country every 5 minutes, even though they should be engaged in this conversation. And that, I think, is a strategic communications challenge. How do you get people to reflect, to be more self-reflexive, and to engage with these very, very difficult questions? And maybe we're asking too much. I don't know.
Just a few words. Miroslav Sazdowski just wrote that he's ill and he will not participate, so we have half an hour more for our discussion.
Only if you wish. Or you could go shopping for half an hour, if you prefer.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir, for this inspiring speech. It's really example for strategic communication, because you address long-term issues. I have two short questions. First, you already mentioned elections in US.
Yeah.
And how this MAGA, or Make America Great Again, is related to strategic communication. What does it mean, America to be great again? For myself, America was the greatest nation on 4th of April 1949, when the Washington Treaty was signed.
Yeah.
It is the best achievement ever. But maybe he has in mind something different. So this is my question. A second question is much more practical, and I really understand much better now the difference between strategic communication and countering disinformation. And from this practical aspect, yes, we have this Center of Excellence on Strategic Communication in Riga. We even have this Center of Excellence on Hybrid Warfare in Helsinki. But obviously, it is not the right place to go deeper in countering disinformation, because countering disinformation, as you said, is much more tactical, oriented to capabilities, to operations, to measurable success in short term, and requires a lot of funding, because this is practical issue. Strategic communication could survive with less funding, but for countering disinformation, we need much more funding, much more people, and practical work. Historically, NATO is dealing with such new issues, like cyber defense, for example, considering them in the context of crisis management, implementing the crisis management concept until we reach the point to understand that we could move this to Article 5.
Yeah.
And it is exactly what happened with cybersecurity and cyber defense. Probably we will see the same process about countering disinformation.
That's interesting.
We will start as crisis management because we are in crisis when it comes to
Yeah.
disinformation.
Yeah.
And step by step, developing enough understanding, capabilities, learning from successful operations,
Yeah.
we could move this to Article 5 to guarantee sovereignty of our information space that is as essential as land, air, sea, etc. So what is your view on this, how we going to address this through this transformational network of centers of excellence? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting idea that you're proposing there. And it seems to kind of be in the evolutionary cycle, particularly in, I mean, we talk about NATO because it's the biggest political and military alliance in the world, but also because it's directly relevant to what's going on in not just in Ukraine, but we would argue in many other states in Europe that are being penetrated and subverted by Russia, and not just Russia, but directly by Russia. I'm interested in that you use crisis management, because I think crisis management, you say it's the same as disinformation. Yes, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is it's a kind of more general concept, and that both act in the same way and have the same influence on actually potentially undermining strategic communications. Because, and I think crisis, first of all, what is a crisis? When is a crisis not a crisis? Is a crisis, how long does a crisis last? 1 day? 1 week? 1 month? 1 year? 1 decade? I don't know. We're very loose on the idea of what is a crisis. It's something we kind of feel. But increasingly, why I'm very careful about using the word crisis is because we are kind of slipping into a kind of lexical inflation. We undermine our own language by overuse. The problem with the crisis is that one responds, even if an organization, institution, government has protocols, standard operating procedures in place on how to deal with what it perceives as a crisis. The difficulty is that it is looking down at its feet always, rather than looking up at the sky. If strategic communications looks up at the sky, crisis comms looks down at its feet. And the problem there is, because one is so focused on trying to address the immediate urgency, that one loses sight of mistakes that can be made that can undermine the long-term vision, and all the investment has been made in trying to achieve that long-term vision. So the same applies to disinformation, of course, except disinformation, I think we should stop thinking of it so much as an event, but as a process, and not just as a lifelong process, but as perhaps this is now in the very fabric of the buildings. It is what our lives are all about, which is open, hostile subversion between what I would argue is liberal democracy, which I believe in, with all its faults. It's still, I have three little boys, grandchildren. I want them to grow up in a democratic world that respects freedoms, not in the alternatives that are being put forward. The difficulty is that where crisis merges into the best attempts at strategic communications. Let's look at 2 examples, yeah? I think it's quite useful just to look at a couple of case studies. One way it went wrong and one way it went right in strategic communications, but they also feature different forms of disinformation and different interpretations of crisis. Afghanistan. 20-year involvement in Afghanistan on the part of Western states. Initially, a crisis prompted the invasion of Afghanistan. What was essentially a police action turned into counterterrorism. And if strategic communications is about telling stories, some people call them narratives, I call them stories, then Afghanistan is the unsuccessful rolling out of 4 or 5 stories through which nation states tried to account for their actions, explain why they were in Afghanistan. So initially there was the police story. We're going after a bunch of criminals, terrorists, who've run away to Afghanistan. Let's go get them. That merged into a second story. As soon as the Al-Qaeda people were taken into the Pashtun Code of Honor with the Pashtun Taliban. Story number 2 became, okay, how do we deny the Taliban and Al-Qaeda their funding? Well, the best way is we destroy the poppy crop, the heroin trade, which the Taliban were taxing, if not complicit with particular warlords. That didn't work, so one harvest was destroyed. Next year, it was allowed to grow again because it didn't work. Then we moved into a third story. Counterterrorism started to move into counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency understood as the combination of counterterrorism and aid and development work coming together. So what does that mean? It means you keep chasing the bad guys, you arrest them for intelligence, or you kill them. Aid and development at the same time means build schools, build clinics, build hospitals, build roads, build dams, and also, as that story progressed, work on investing in women's rights. So the next story that replaced that, as the strategic communicators became drawn into what was a military-led activity in the end, where political control started to really weaken and where different governments lost track of why they were there, it turned into, how do we build a liberal democracy? So liberal democratic elections, plus the notion of, well, liberal democratic elections inevitably lead, don't they, to the construction of a Western state, nation state. And then under Joe Biden, we saw the ignominious retreat from Kabul. That was a strategic communications failure, abject failure. I'll give you a much smaller one, which I think is a success. And it's not because I'm from the UK. I just saw close up and was involved with people who worked on the Salisbury, on the Skripal case. And it was mentioned yesterday, I think, by a couple of people. And you know, it was a Russian double agent and his daughter who were poisoned with Novichok, military grade, which was smeared on the door of the door handle of the front door of their house in the town of Salisbury, city of Salisbury, in England in March 2018. And I think this is where strategic communications worked. What Russia did very quickly in the first 3 weeks was to push, and I think we counted, 48 different stories into the media space. Now, the point of that, you're all familiar with this, you know all this. The point was not to establish a single truth. The point was to subvert through uncertainty, to confuse. And maybe some people would believe. So of these stories, I'll give you 2 of the stories. One was that Porton Down Biological War Research Laboratory, not that far from town, there was a leak. And somehow it got onto the door handle of this Russian double agent's house. For him and his daughter to touch the door handle didn't really explain why it didn't touch anybody else's door handle or anybody else. Another story that was floating around was that at the time we had a Prime Minister, Theresa May, that she had actually driven down to Salisbury and smeared it on the door handle herself. Now, make of that what you will. I would hope that not many people thought the Prime Minister actually had the time or inclination to go and do that herself. But maybe one or two people thought, well, you know, it's only a few miles away from the laboratory, maybe there was a leak, maybe it escaped. Who knows what people think? In the end, it doesn't matter about the individual stories, because it's not about rebutting the stories. And all of you who work in counter-disinformation and counter-FEMI know you don't get involved in rebutting stories other than to provide evidence-based truth-telling as a response. But what the UK government and the new National Security Communications unit that sat within the Cabinet Office at the time in early 2018, what they did, quite wisely, was, highlight the stories, show that they're really quite ridiculous, but let other people make up their minds. You don't need to tell people, respect people, they're smart enough. Let them see what these 48 different stories amounted to. But what the government actually did was to say, hey, look what's going on here. Let us just step back from all this. Let us show you that a methodology is in play here. This is a game that is being played with you as the victims. This is how they're doing it. They crowd the media space to confuse, to reinforce uncertainty and any division. So that worked well. In terms of strategic communications, what worked very well was how do you link the domestic space to the foreign space, to the diplomatic area, where the UK government worked closely with member states of the European Union and also with the United States. And what followed were a large number, I can't remember, something like 160 or 200 expulsion of Russian agents from various countries. The Russians also expelled Western representatives. That doesn't matter. The point had been made that Western states would cooperate to push back Russian attempts at subversion. And so you went from what seemed to be really quite a minor incursion to something which was really quite, on the diplomatic front, really quite significant, and made a big statement. And I think that's a success story in the way that that was, what, a 3-month success story compared with the 20-year unsuccessful strategic communications account in Afghanistan. Perhaps a far more complex situation, definitely a more complex situation. Going back to your MAGA point, I've never been sure what making America great again means, other than kind of resonating with Republicans particularly, who were old enough to remember Ronald Reagan, who is in American, certainly maybe in the 20th century, when you think about which American presidents the United States reveres, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, maybe Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy for a different reason. Then we jump all the way to Ronald Reagan. I think that's it. But there's a resonance with Ronald Reagan, who talked about it, and it resonates even further back in American history, this make America great again. In the mouth of Donald Trump, is it just a device? Is it just a tool? What is it? It's a rallying call, yes. Does it have any substance? I don't know what great means. But it certainly worked. And if it gets Elon Musk jumping up and down and hopping like a bunny rabbit on stage, it works for half the population, doesn't work for the other half. In strategic communications terms, no. But in political communications, yeah, it appears to be a successful device. but I don't think it has any vision attached to it. I think it's just a rallying call. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you think there's more substance there.
Maybe the man on the left behind.
Thank you. Colonel Ruslav from the MOD. Dr. Bolt, thank you for being with us, and thank you for the visionary talk you gave us. I can tell you that I've learned a lot, but I praise myself as a practitioner as much as I can in this field. So I'm not going to ask you a political question. I'm not throwing myself under the bus of the American
It's
politics
okay.
for certainly.
Please do, but please feel free.
Certainly not standing here with uniform. But a bit more practical advice that I would like to solicit from you. One of the issues we've encountered here is how do we convince leadership first to commit resources to countering FIMI, not disinformation. One of my teams has been, I'm not in the business of fighting disinformation. Whack-a-mole doesn't work. We don't do that. We counter foreign interference, which is about influence. This is what we're trying to prevent.
Yeah, exactly.
Them gaining influence,
Yeah.
them delegitimizing our governments and form of government, if you wish, and so forth. So here's the debacle we're in. How do we convince our decision makers, our leaders, one, to commit more resources? You spoke about it briefly earlier. And second, not to reach for the easiest and closest tool, which is PR. Oh, we have to do more PR. And it has happened, maybe not only here, I know in other countries it has happened too. How do we convince leadership, and I'm very often trying to speak like to a 6-year-old, that PR doesn't do it, whack-a-mole doesn't do it, Stratcom is about more holistic, more comprehensive approach, which might even require different set of skills. Thank you.
No, thank you. And it's a central question. And Rachel, who's sitting in front of you, who has to deal with exactly that kind of question every day of her life inside the UK Foreign Office, will testify to how difficult it is to actually persuade. Because it is a balance between internal persuasion and also external prompts. And those external prompts are usually when something goes wrong. Because governments have, to use your term, crises every day. And they come from all directions, not just from disinformation or foreign malign influence. And I think I just put in parentheses here, we have to be a bit careful also, don't we? And I've always been critical of this term FIMI, and I said to, I've had numerous long evenings discussing it with Lutz Göllner, who, as you know, developed the FIMI unit in Brussels in the EU, but has now gone off to be ambassador to Taiwan, that it's wrong for us always. In this case, Bulgaria is a complex society, complex country, Bulgaria, from what I can understand. And the situation is different in different countries. But I think I've always been concerned about calling something FIMI, and only FIMI, when in fact I think it is also DIMI, because we're looking at domestic malign influence as well. And sometimes the domestic malign influence actually requires no support from outside, no funding, no encouragement. It is inherently in our own populace and our own domestic system. And sometimes it is something which is being prompted from outside, and sometimes the two combine. But and I can understand why the European Union doesn't like to identify and go down the road of domestic malign influence. It's very sensitive, but at some stage, you've got to stand up and be counted. You've got to actually say, you've got to call a spade, and not hide behind other acronyms. But I think it's, as with most politics, a balance between internal persuasion, which requires enormous stamina from people such as yourself and Rachel sitting in front of you, and spend most of your life trying to persuade your own people that there is a problem. And what persuades politicians is when something goes wrong in the public space. And that usually accelerates the agenda. So there's no magic bullet that gets strategic communications to be embraced in that sense. I'm glad you mentioned public relations, because, and I'm sure we have a very sophisticated gathering here today, but you know, one of the problems that we all face is that as strategic communications and disinformation, or the counter-disinformation work has been undertaken by media agencies, the media agency space, otherwise, campaign companies, advertising agencies, marketing companies, public relations companies, so often public relations companies, what is public relations? Damage limitation, image building. They call themselves strategic communicators. I think that's a joke. Yeah? And so I'm very glad that you raised that today, because I think that's really important.
Okay, maybe last questions. Susanne Spahn. Okay.
Thank you very much for your interesting speech. I'm doing research on Russian disinformation in Germany.
Yeah.
And I would like to tell you that, to my mind, Russia is performing very well in Germany. And fulfilling the task, as you've defined it, to identify particular audiences and try to engage with them.
Yeah.
So they're really doing a good job, and I would like to ask you if you have any insight into Russian strategic communication.
Yes, they don't do it.
They don't do it.
No. They do political communications and geopolitical. That's the whole point. Unless Russia signs up to a value system that cherishes the rights and pursues and safeguards and promotes the rights of individuals, individual freedoms, they're not doing strategic communications. They're doing political communications or geopolitical communications, and they can be extremely successful at that. Look, I spend a lot of time in Asia Pacific. I go 5 or 6 times a year to Japan, and I work with the Japanese government and I work with other governments in the region. China is the big threat. Asian culture, very broadly speaking, gross generalization, is a far more transactional culture. And when I go there and say, because they want to do the democratic South Korea, Japan, Philippines, even Indonesia, they want to engage with strategic communications. So I talk to them about it. And they say, and what do we need to do? And I say, you need to honor individual freedoms. Right, they say. And I say, it's part of a value system that underpins, along with, transparency, accountability, and accessibility, what we consider a working democracy to be. And they say, we don't do values in Asia Pacific. And I say, what? You must do, everybody does values. We just have different values. We sit within a liberal democratic ideology understood as a systematic body of joined up thinking. Russia doesn't. I don't actually think Russia or China have ideologies. I don't think authoritarianism is an ideology. I just think it is a counter-ideology. It's a route to expedient governance. But what I hear then in Asia Pacific is, yeah, we don't do values. And I say, what do you do? Well, we have principles. And I said, what are principles? Are they just watered down values? Do you or do you not believe in protecting the rights and promoting the rights of individuals? And then a couple of the states say, yes, we do. And I said, fine. We can call it what you want, but that is the measure of whether you're in or out. So when you say Russia, is being very successful in Germany, and clearly your research, which is fascinating research that you're doing, and I loved your presentation yesterday. I thought it was excellent. I think they're doing very successful political communications. And hearing also when you developed your thoughts and listening to you last night as well, in terms of this long-term relationship between Germany and Russia that goes, as you are arguing, goes back centuries, not even decades, but centuries, this proximity between the two national cultures, if that's the right way of putting it. That exists in the geopolitical space, and Russia is successful geopolitically in Germany, as you have demonstrated. What it isn't doing is strategic communications. They don't care about the rights of the individual. And I think, I say this in a very normative and unashamed way. I don't know why we keep apologizing in Western states for being liberal Democrats. There's a litany, there's a long list of mistakes that we have made. And yes, own up to your mistakes, but stop eternally apologizing for them and look for the strengths in our value system. If we're not careful, we're going to... So in the first decade of this century, I spent a long time working on anti-fundamentalist political Islam. And governments and also academics invested a lot of time and energy and money, certainly for the first decade, in countering what were then called narratives. So Al-Qaeda or ISIS narratives, we then engaged with counter-narratives. And after 10 years, we kind of came to the conclusion, well, they don't work, do they? They just don't work. We're not making any progress. Why is that? And the thinking was that if you frame your own activities as a countering operation, you will always be in a reactive mode. And you're always chasing the person who is setting the agenda. You're always playing the game, the match, by somebody else's rules. And you can't win, because they will change the rules on you. They will keep redefining them. And so we decided that with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we had to flip to the opposite, which now you would call information integrity, which was going from the negative, from one foot, the left foot, to the right foot, and going on the offensive, which is to establish very publicly, support and promote and project what you saw as the positive aspects of your own offering. Stop talking about the other people and start talking about yourselves. What is the good stuff that you have to offer that makes you so attractive? Yes, okay, in many respects we're unattractive, but in so many respects, what we have is what other people in the world want. And so this is one of my concerns with even talking about counter-disinformation. I prefer that we stop imagining ourselves as being responsive, reactive, and get into a preemptive mode. We need to get ahead of the game and get other people to chase our rule setting and our agenda setting. And the only way we do that is to actually have what the Americans love to call the beacon on the hill. I think we have to have what is desirable. And if people want it, then we have to support their possible means of acquiring what we have. If they don't want it, that's their choice. And that's the beauty of our system of values, which is we give people choice. The others wouldn't give us choice.